Hi, my name is Kıvılcım Yavuz. I am the first and postdoctoral researcher of the Kenneth Spencer Research Library at the University of Kansas, working on enhancing access to the library's substantial holdings of medieval and early modern manuscripts. In this presentation, I will talk about one of the manuscripts at the Arnamagnæan Collection, AM 377 Folio, which has been recently identified as the long thought to be lost library catalogue of Hernando Colón. Hernando Colón, more commonly known in English as Ferdinand Columbus, was the second son of the famous navigator Christopher Columbus. Hernando had one of the most significant book collections in history, and by the time of his death in 1539, his impressive library is estimated to have contained over 15,000 printed books and manuscripts, as well as around 3,200 sheets of prints. The importance of Colón's collection is not just its size, however. The classification systems that Hernando devised to catalog and access his collection are quite elaborate, and the inventories he developed are considered to have laid the foundations of modern library cataloging systems. Thus, what is perhaps more intriguing than the contents of the collection for historians of the book is the way in which Colón organized his library and cataloged his books. Based on contemporary testimonies, we know that Hernando was very keen on organization of knowledge as well as keeping track of his collection, especially by creating cross-reference registers. The importance he placed on this endeavor is perhaps best displayed on his coat of arms that is included in his will, which features the four main inventories of his library: Book of Authors, Book of Subjects or Topics, Book of Themes or Keywords, and Book of Epitomes. AM377 Folio is a clean copy of one of these inventories, the Book of Epitomes, which, in Matthew Driscoll's words, was hiding in plain sight at the Arnamagnæan Collection in Copenhagen. In March 2019, during when I was conducting research on the non-Nordic manuscripts in the Arnamagnæan Collection, we announced that AM377 Folio was identified as the Book of Epitomes of Hernando Colón's library. The news about the identification of the manuscript and the fact that it belonged to Hernando Colón made headlines in a series of media outlets across the globe from Brazil to Japan. It received so much attention that we now even have a Wikipedia page for the Book of Epitomes. Shortly after this announcement, I wrote about the story of the rediscovery of the manuscript and my initial findings in a blog post which you can read on the Institute's website. In November 2019, we were awarded funding from the Carlsberg Foundation to pursue a 3-year project on the Book of Epitomes, its contents and the circumstances in which it came to Denmark. You will hear more from my colleagues during this session about the project itself. In the remainder of my presentation, I will focus mostly on the material aspects and the history of AM377 Folio. As I mentioned, his library was very important for Hernando. Yet the provisions he put in place in his will for the maintenance and continuance of this library failed, like many collectors before and after him. In his will, irrespective of who will inherit his estate, Hernando Colón asks that Juan Perez continues overseeing the library after his death. Following Colón's death, Juan Perez, the person who was left in charge of his library, recorded how the library was organized in a document entitled Memoria de las Obras y Libros de Don Hernando Colón. He outlined the state of the collection as well as Colón's wishes as to how it should be maintained and continued. In Perez's Memoria, we also find extensive information about the cross-referencing system of the library as well as its registers. He states that Don Hernando began four most marvelous works, the first of epitomes, the second of themes, the third of authors, the fourth of subjects, which were begun and to a great extent completed, and they are in the library. According to Perez, there were several manuscripts in different stages of drafting that contained these four inventories of the library, all of which were left unfinished at the time of Colón's death. He then goes on to describe the state of each inventory. Here is what he says about the Book of Epitomes. There are two old books in quarto, written by hand in a bad hand, bound in parchment and tied together, which are the epitomes of the books in the library, which is to say, summaries of what each book contains at greater length. And one of them is transcribed into another large book. Of the other one, there is no fair copy. There is besides a large book with folio pages bound in white parchment, written by hand in a good hand, which contains the clean copies of the epitomes transcribed from the old one we mentioned, the one in quarto and in a very bad hand. AM 377 folio is this large book with folio pages written in a good hand. When we look at the Arnamagnæan manuscript, however, the first thing we notice is that it does not have a white parchment binding as described by Perez. Indeed, it currently has a light brown cardboard binding. The reason is that AM 377 folio was rebound in Denmark several centuries after Perez's Memoria was put down into writing in Spain. When the manuscript is examined, we see that the paper used for the front paste down and the front flyleaf is markedly different than the paper used in the rest of the manuscript. The single sheet that was utilized for this purpose has a different texture and a bluish hue, and it contains a watermark that is almost visible with the naked eye. When the front flyleaf is examined with a fiber optic light sheet, the watermark becomes more legible. This watermark comes from the Øholm Nymølle paper mill on the Mølleo River in Zealand, north of Copenhagen in Denmark. Øholm and Nymølle paper mills were established in 1793 and 1794 respectively by Henry Nelthrop and John Joseph Harris, two English businessmen who had already been conducting business in Denmark since 1785 as leather manufacturers. However, this specific watermark is not one of the early watermarks used by Nelthrop and Harris, and it seems to have been introduced when Henry's son John Bromley Nelthrop was in charge of papermaking between 1805 and 1832. Indeed, the only other example I was able to find is from a document dated to 1830. As you might notice, the chain lines are different in AM 377 folio and this tracing, but the lettering is identical, so I think we would be safe to say that the Book of Epitomes was rebound sometime around 1820s or 1830s. There are 12 manuscripts with Spanish origins at the Arnamagnæan Collection that have parchment bindings. They are all alum-toed, therefore would fit the description that Juan Perez gave as white parchment. I believe the Book of Epitomes had an alum-toed parchment binding like these, which was very typical in Spain during the 16th and 17th centuries. As a matter of fact, the conservation work carried out by Natasha Fazluk, the conservator of the Arnamagnæan Institute, in the past year, confirmed our initial observations that the book block was not disturbed during the rebinding in the 19th century, and that the manuscript had all the signs of having had an earlier parchment case binding, including 3 sewing supports made out of alum-toed leather and parchment strips that are adhered to the spine to reinforce the structure of the book and the attachment of the cover to the book block. As it stands, AM 377 folio contains 974 leaves and it is the thickest manuscript in the Arnamagnæan collection, measuring 144 millimeters. It has 118 gatherings that are mostly made up of 8 leaves each. The beginning of the manuscript is missing, and in its present state it begins in the middle of an epitome, record number 140. Based on the rest of the manuscript and the average length of the records, I think there are about 4 gatherings of 10 leaves each are missing from the beginning. The manuscript ends with record number 2330, with 3 gatherings in the middle containing blank leaves. The number of the records is consecutive throughout the manuscript, so it seems that these gatherings were used as placeholders for the epitomes that were to be copied in between, as the summaries that would correspond to these leaves are also missing from the manuscript. There is no record of acquisition for AM 377 folio, so we do not know exactly when and how it came into the possession of Árni Magnússon. The most comprehensive printed catalogue of the Arnamagnæan collection still in use was prepared by Christian Colón and was published in two volumes in 1889 and 1894. From 1883 until his death in 1919, Colón was the librarian and the keeper of the manuscripts at the Arnamagnæan. This is the short description for AM 377 folio provided by Colón. It states that the manuscript was described in the old catalogue as, on various authors and judgments on their writings, the book is marked ES. A similar explanation is also summarized in Danish afterwards as Comprehensive Dictionary of Non-Nordic Authors in Latin. Indeed, some 150 years earlier, the manuscript was listed exactly as such in the old manuscript catalogues of the Arnamagnæan Collection, prepared by Jon Olafsson of Grunewig after Árni Magnússon's death in 1730. This description of AM 377 folio by Jon Olafsson in the oldest catalogues of the Arnamagnæan Collection matches the description of the folio manuscript number 10 in the catalogue of an auction which was printed in 1682. So now we have a trail to follow from the most recent description of the manuscript in the late 19th century all the way back to a previous owner in the second half of the 17th century. This auction catalogue contains books and manuscripts that belonged to Cornelius Pedersen Lerche, who had died the year before. Lerche was the Danish ambassador to Spain between 1650 and 1653, and then again between 1658 and 1662, during which periods he is supposed to have collected a number of manuscripts. Along with AM 377 folio, I was able to trace 17 of the manuscripts in the Arnamagnæan collection, all of which have connections to Spain, back to the collection of Lerche with some confidence. Árni Magnússon, however, could not have acquired these manuscripts directly from this auction held by Lerche's estate, so there must have been one or more owners between the time Lerche's manuscripts were sold off and that of Árni's acquisition. This intermediary collector is usually assumed to be Jens Rosenkrantz, as it is known that he had acquired many of Lerche's print books and that Árni acquired manuscripts from him. However, at this point, we do not have any corroborating evidence to support this claim that Rosenkrantz was also a previous owner of AM 377 folio. As I mentioned, the beginning of the manuscript is missing. There is no title page or rubric or any other explanation as to what the manuscript contains or what its purpose is. There is no identifying mark on the manuscript that could immediately indicate any relation whatsoever to Hernando Colón or Spain either. Two signatures that are found on the recto of the first folio, however, are of interest with respect to the history of the manuscript. The one on the upper left, which reads V339, belongs to an as yet unidentified Danish auctioneer or collector who could be Jens Rosenkrantz. I found 14 Spanish manuscripts in the Arnamagnæan collection with a similar signature, always beginning with the letter V and continued with a 2 or 3-digit number. Not only that, these signatures are also found in manuscripts that belong to Christian Reitzer, another well-known Danish book collector and a contemporary of Árni Magnússon. I am fairly certain that these signatures were introduced to the Spanish manuscripts, including AM 377 folio, after their arrival to Denmark, but before Árni's acquisition, as some of the other manuscripts that contain these signatures were produced in Denmark and likely have never left. Now, the signature in the middle of the margin is a different story. If you remember, the description of the manuscript recorded by Jon Olafsson and later by Christian Kolund read that the book is marked ES. This is actually not ES, but E5. And this marginal annotation, E5, is in fact a signature that points to another book collection whose library catalog also survives. The entry that corresponds to AM 377 folio reads, "The Library of Distinguished Men and the Works They Have Written, a large book of 2,330 authors, folio E5." Considering not only that the signature of the manuscript matches that of the entry, but also that the last record number in AM 377 folio as it stands is 2330, there can hardly be any doubt that this entry denotes the same manuscript. The inventory in which we find this reference to AM 377 folio belonged to another famous book collector in Spain, Gaspar de Guzman, 1st Duke of Sanlúcar and 3rd Count of Olivares. Known as the Count Duke of Olivares, Gaspar de Guzman was a member of the royal court of King Philip IV of Spain and served as prime minister between 1621 and 1643. His library catalogue, in which we find this entry, is reported to be composed in 1627 and was preserved at the palace of the Duke of Alba until at least 1744 when this copy was made. The dating 1627 puts the catalogue during the lifetime of Gaspar de Guzman and probably under his supervision. My examination of the rest of the manuscripts in the Arnamagnæan collection revealed that there are at least 4 manuscripts, including AM 377 folio, that can be traced back to Spain to the renowned library of Gaspar de Guzman through their signatures. I should also add that none of these signatures were ever recorded in the older catalogues, except for AM 377 folio, which was recorded incorrectly. So to wrap up, it is not surprising that AM 377 folio remained unrecognized as one of the catalogues of Hernando Colón's library until now. There is no identifying mark on the manuscript, the initial gatherings are missing, and the current binding of the manuscript dates back to the early 19th century. We do not know exactly what happened to the Book of Epitomes after Colón's death in 1539. The last known reference is in Juan Perez's Memoria, which was composed shortly after. Even though there were extremely detailed provisions with regard to the maintenance and continuance of the library in Colón's will, after several years of contestation regarding the ownership of the library following his death, the collection was handed over to the Cathedral of Seville in 1552. By this time, however, it is thought that maybe about half of the books were already dispersed. It seems that by 1627, when the manuscripts of Count Duke of Olivares were catalogued, if not before, the Book of Epitomes had already left the Seville Cathedral Library, if it was ever there in the first place. Not only was the manuscript already separated from the rest of Colón's collection by 1627, if not earlier, but also the first few gatherings were already lost while the manuscript was still in Spain, along with the connection to the famous library of Hernando Colón. So the beginning of the manuscript has been missing since the manuscript was in Spain for about 4 centuries. While scholars working on Hernando Colón's library thought the Book of Epitomes was lost forever, it has been in Denmark for the past 350 years. Most recently, for about 300 years, it has been part of the collection of Árni Magnússon, cared by the University of Copenhagen since Árni's death. By all accounts, that the manuscript had originated from Hernando Colón's library was not known to the several previous owners of the manuscript. Yet the manuscript was valued, kept, and cared for to this day as part of other prominent collections. I would like to leave you with a little message from the early 16th century from Hernando Colón's library. Did you notice that one gathering in the middle of the manuscript that was missing a leaf? While we were doing the collation of AM 377 folio with Natasha in the spring of 2019, we found a stub in between two leaves indicating that a leaf was cut out of the manuscript. And then we noticed that there was a little note on it. It said, to our surprise, "Cut off this leaf" in Spanish. This message, written by one of the scribes, was presumably an instruction for the binder of the manuscript. It is also telling that this message was written in the vernacular, although almost the entirety of the epitomes were composed in Latin and the manuscript was meticulously copied in Latin. This is all to say that there is much to discover, not only about the contents, but also about the materiality and history of AM 377 folio. Thank you for listening. I look forward to your comments and questions.